The third thing that I would point to is that you can't just reward victories in a sense. Like you have to redefine what does it mean to be successful as an organization. So trying and failing early and then moving on to the right thing should be rewarded rather than punished. So sort of having the humility to know you might be wrong and then having the agility to then say, okay, we tried these different options, these didn't work well, but now it set us on this different path that set us up for long-term success is an important part of creating an organization that's going to thrive by leveraging experiments.
Hello and welcome to Experimentation Masters, the leading resource for business experimentation. Join fellow innovators, strategists, and entrepreneurs to learn practical tips, methods, and techniques from world-leading experts in experimentation. Design better experiments, lead with more confidence, and have greater impact in your organization. Now please welcome your host, Gavin Bryant.
Hello and welcome to the Experimentation Masters podcast. Today, I would like to welcome Michael Luca to the show. Michael is an associate professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. His research, teaching, and advisory work focuses on the design of online platforms, on the ways in which data can inform managerial and policy decisions. His research has been published in leading academic journals. He's also written about behavioural economics and online platforms for media outlets, including the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and Wired. At Harvard, Professor Luca developed and teaches an MBA course on using experiments to guide managerial decisions, called From Data to Decisions, leveraging experiments for effective strategy, marketing, and entrepreneurship. In this episode, we're going to dive into the book that Michael co-authored with Max Bazerman, The Power of Experiments, Decision-Making in a Data-Driven World. Welcome to the show, Michael.
Thanks, Gavin, for having me.
So let's just discuss your start with experimentation. Where did you find your way into experimentation and develop your passion for experimentation?
So in my research, I've always been interested in how insights and tools from the social sciences can be useful for organizations. So over the years, I've done a lot of work with companies and with governments around this. And during that journey, I've done a lot of work where I run my own experiments and help to provide guidance to organizations. But the thing that I realized and had a series of conversations with Max about is that it's no longer just the insights from social sciences. So it's not just the findings of experiments that are becoming interested for organizations, but it's the experimentation process itself. We notice that it's no longer just sort of this esoteric set of academics that are running experiments and coming up with insights and then telling those insights to people, but it's actually companies and governments that are saying, how can I better use data? How can I better use experiments to help guide my decisions in a day-to-day process? And what we've been interested in is the complementarity between some of the tools and findings from social sciences and how we could put this into practice in organizations so that they could take the academic research as starting points, but then further develop their own processes and their own findings.
Excellent. So thinking about your own personal philosophy or your experimentation thesis, what are some of your guiding principles that you work to with experimentation?
For me, experiments often start with really asking the right question. So if you're a leader, your organization, you're a decision maker, it's important to realize that having data and having experiments is not quite enough. You need to have the right frameworks to map from those experiments back to decisions that are at hand. And it's an area that I've been passionate about because I think that there's often a gap between the experiments that are being run and the decisions that are being put into place.
And we'll come back later in the podcast to a really good example that Michael provides around Alibaba, which highlights that it's really important to ask the right question up front, which informs the direction of the hypotheses and experiments. So we'll come back to that one. So let's start off with a somewhat philosophical question, maybe. Do you think that it's fair and reasonable to compare digital online experiments to social science and medical experiments?
So I think there are parts that are analogous. I think that when we think about where experimentation has become more common, so you can think about it in academic research, you can think about it in medical trials, and now you can think about online platforms and the tech sector. So what makes the tech sector a good fit for experimentation? Like, how do they discover that? Well, we could think about some features of the tech sector. They have data, they have outcomes that they're actually measuring. They have a large number of people often that are engaging with the platform. And then they're able to randomize people into different treatments. So if you're deciding whether a platform should have a blue background or a yellow background, you don't have to just guess. You don't have to just have a discussion on one team about it. You could just test the two and try to figure out which one people are more likely to engage with. So I think the dropping costs of data, the increased technical ease of running experiments have sort of come to the forefront of why we see more experiments in tech. But there's also something else that's going on. And even though parts of the book are focused on the tech sector, we point to another set of organizations where experimentation has become common, which has some similar themes, but also some others, which is government. So we talk about the behavioral insights team. We focus on the UK and one of the chapters there, but Australia has one as well. And countries are increasingly growing these teams that are focused on decision making. So why experimentation there? I think over the last 50 years or so, we've seen a growing body of evidence that it's hard to understand exactly what would work. Our intuition can often be flawed, and experiments and other types of data are one way to help check our intuition and help to make sure that we're removing biases from our decisions where possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, excellent point. So thinking about the leadership toolkit, in your book, you highlight that experimentation is a critical component of any leadership toolkit in the new age of management. Why should experimentation be a critical component of any leader's toolkit?
So it's a real blind spot if you're not thinking about experiments as a leader. Now, you might ask yourself, do I think my organization should be trying new things? Most leaders would say yes. Should I have a sense of humility? Most leaders should say yes. Should I get more information about what will work when it's feasible? Most leaders would say yes. So then you should be experimenting, and you should be seeking out not only your own experiments, but looking to the literature, looking to your other organizations and their experiments to try to learn more about what works and what doesn't work.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think holds leaders back from taking that step to start trying experimentation in the first instance?
So it's a great question. So I think part of this is just that experimentation hasn't really been in the common vernacular for all that long, right? So I think we sort of have historically thought of this as a social science tool, maybe a little bit in medical trials. Now, more recently, recently being decades, I thought about it in the context of tech platforms and maybe evaluating ads. But let me give a concrete example of how hard it is to change the culture of an organization. We can think about the tech platform, eBay. So we have a chapter on this in the book. Now, they've been running lots of experiments. So it's an experiment-heavy organization. They have data. They know how to use data. Well, the thing that we talk about in the book isn't necessarily an early success, but it's actually a culture change that got us intrigued about eBay and experimentation. So they had been experimenting on the design of their platform, and they had been advertising on Google ads and Bing ads and other advertising platforms to kind of bring people in to eBay, encourage people to use their platform. Now, they have been running this thinking, our platform seems to work, and they had some evidence. And in fact, they had hired a consulting company to come in and do an analysis of the impact of their ads. And they produced a number of compelling facts. So they showed them that the people that were seeing the ads were likely to buy stuff on eBay afterwards. Maybe that seems like a success. Then they looked at how their ad spending varied over time and across place, and saw, okay, well, when you are advertising more in California than New York, then you see a spike in purchases in California relative to New York. So you look at this data and it seems like it's a win. But a group of economists who are trained in the tools of causal inference had actually come in and said, not so fast. You haven't run an experiment here. There are some problems with that analysis. In particular, ads are very targeted. So if you're just looking at where ads are getting spent, they're going to be sent to people who are most likely to be purchasing on eBay anyway. So this team of economists, Tom Blake, Steve Chalice, Chris Nosko, ran this large-scale experiment where they actually started with some natural experiments, then ran a new experiment where they turned on and off eBay ads in different markets. And what they found is that most of the money, which is about $50 million a year, that eBay was spending on ads seemed to be a waste. And that the problem was that the people who are coming in through ads seemed like they would have come to eBay anyway. And it's the experiment that taught them this lesson. So what did eBay do afterwards? So there were a couple of things they did. So they kind of changed their strategy a little bit, but not only did they tweak their ads, which I think is of interest probably to only a subset of people who would be listening here, but what I think is a general lesson is that they thought about other areas where they might then start experimenting. Should they just have a more experimental mindset for all of the ads that they're running? So I think once you start to think like that, you say, look, even if you're already running some experiments, you as a leader should be thinking about what are the different pieces of my organization and where might I bring in a little bit more data to help guide my decisions. Not only is that going to help me discover new things, but that's going to help me to test existing products and services and see if we've been on the right track for things we're doing.
Yeah, it's a fantastic example there. Just to dive in a little bit deeper on one of the points you touched on there earlier was culture. So if leaders are seeking to create an organization that's dedicated to experimentation and evidence-based decision-making, the culture is really important. Are you able to highlight some of those cultural transformations that are necessary to start on that journey with experimentation?
Yeah, so I think some of this is just leaders being willing to engage in discussions of data and evidence. Now, what are some of the things that you need to get right? So you need to think, what are my objectives as an organization? And when I'm running experiments, are the outcomes that I'm measuring aligned with the outcomes that I care about? Like I want my KPIs to sort of be as closely kind of connected back to the things that I'm measuring, which are going to be different, right, as possible. So one is sort of thinking about our objective functions. The second is thinking about what are you as a leader trying to learn from an experiment? Like, are you trying to evaluate one specific product, one specific service, or are you trying to develop some sort of internal framework? So I think kind of a leader who understands that different purposes that experiments could play is going to have an organization that then gets more out of experimentation. The third thing that I would point to is that you can't just reward victories in a sense. Like you have to redefine what does it mean to be successful as an organization. So trying and failing early and then moving on to the right thing should be rewarded rather than punished. So sort of having the humility to know you might be wrong and then having the agility to then say, okay, we tried these different options, these didn't work well, but now it set us on this different path that set us up for long-term success is an important part of creating an organization that's going to thrive by leveraging experiments.
A really good point that you make there is about what does success look like for the business, and really in an experimentation-led organization that becomes a focus more about learning and the value of learning. Have you seen instances where that can become problematic? Because if rewards and incentives aren't anchored around learning, then you drive a different behavior.
Yeah, so I would say that in lots of situations that if you're just trying to come up with a thing to pitch a solution without having evidence that it works, it could be problematic. But I guess like I would almost like rephrase that a little bit to think about like what is an example where by tweaking the rewards, and sort of like trying to think a little bit about how can we get more experimentation and clearer evidence that we could benefit. So one example where I was involved is we had done this academic research looking at Airbnb. And Airbnb had already been running like thousands of experiments, right? So they kind of were experimenting at a pretty large scale. And we had come in and started looking at not just the productivity of the platform, but the inclusivity of the platform. And what my co-authors, Ben Edelman, Dan Swirsky, and I had looked at is we ran an experiment where we tested for racial discrimination on the platform. And we found widespread discrimination against African Americans on Airbnb. So we had surfaced our findings. We presented it publicly and spoke with people at Airbnb about it as well. And based on our findings, I think that disconnect there was that the company had been optimizing to too narrow a goal. So they had been thinking about things like short-run conversions on the platforms, but not thinking about the risk of unintended consequences, like the fact that you may be achieving some short-run metric that kind of is in your corporate goals, but not thinking about this long-run inclusivity or lack thereof that they ended up facilitating with it. So as a result of our paper, they created a task force and ultimately created a new team that sort of was centered around thinking about how do you reduce discrimination on the platform. So I think there they rephrase it to learn not just kind of how do we encourage short-run growth, but how do we make reducing discrimination more of a corporate priority as well, and then have experiments that are aligned with the goal of learning how we should go about doing that. I think once they had that mindset, then they trialed a whole bunch of different things to try to see how they could keep growing the platform while not having a platform that facilitated discrimination.
Yeah, there's a really good example in the book that you discuss at greater length there. So I recommend to the audience to review that. And I think that's a really good example of thinking about, you suggested the unintended consequences there. So extrapolating thinking out and looking at more of those second order effects and those third order effects, which can sit outside an immediate and I guess razor sharp focus on a metric. So it's about thinking more broadly about the impacts of those experiments too.
So, and when you say razor, it's some of it is trying to think about things outside of the experiment, but other things are thinking about how do you bring more things inside of the experiment. So once you start thinking about the fact that, I want a platform that's going to be widely used, I also want a platform that's not going to facilitate discrimination, you could bring that more directly into your suite of metrics and take a more holistic view, even though it's still a very data-driven view in how to proceed.
Yeah, that's a good point. So thinking about managerial decision-making, one of the areas that really interests me and I observe in my work is that many leaders are still making decisions that are based on past experiences, intuition, and feelings. Why do you think that so many leaders are still preferring to make decisions in this manner with sometimes not such a focus on an evidence-based decision-making approach?
So let me return, I guess, to the eBay question, like the eBay example for a second, right? Because I think this is also a nice illustration of that. You come in, you're the marketing director, you wrote this marketing campaign, you've designed the whole strategy, and now you're trying to think about, should I run an experiment to show me that the strategy was not effective? Then that's a tricky, it's a tricky territory. Now you've put this leader of this part of the organization in. And I think sort of there we can unbundle that into the different pieces. Like first, once I've designed a thing, I may be more inclined to think that it's going to work, right? So I may be overconfident about something that I just put together. And I think by tweaking the incentives a little bit and tweaking the norms a little bit to get that information seeking step, you could help to combat that in a way that's going to help people think not just how do I design something that's going to work, but how do I design a good test of whether that's going to work. Then sort of building on that a little bit, you could think about how you have different parts of the organization all engaging. So sticking with the eBay experiment a little bit further, there's the marketing team, But note, they also had the econ team that came in to talk about this, and they also had a finance team that was involved. So by having different stakeholders who had different lenses, they were able to sort of break through some of these barriers and get a more holistic view that then push them to do more experimentation. So now we can sort of zoom out and say, you're sitting at a company and you feel like experiments would be helpful, but the other leaders don't all agree. Why don't people agree, and what can I do about it? I think understanding the source of the barriers. Experiments might be costly. The person may not want to find information. They may not have the right incentives. They may want the information, but may not know how to change, even if you bring them new evidence. Those are important barriers. So I would urge leaders to think kind of what are the organizational dynamics, and to overcome those, kind of think, what is the barrier to evidence seeking, and what's the thing I need to do to overcome it? So is it to kind of give more evidence that this is an issue the company should be thinking of to begin with? Is it that I need to help lay a path forward for, like, if we find X, then we'll do this. If we find Y, then we'll do that, and to help get buy-in about what the different paths that you might take are. But I think once you start thinking about those broader organizational issues, it can help to point out, like, what experiments should you run, and where should you be running them, and how should they be designed?
That's a really good point. One of the ways that I think about strategy is that strategy is really just a hypothesis about what may happen in the future. And we really don't know the path to achieve that strategy. So where the experiments become really powerful is that they help you to discover the optimal path to be able to achieve your goals and objectives. So I think flipping the thinking around that, strategy is a set and forget, that a strategy is it's living, it's breathing, and it is effectively a hypothesis or theory around what we think may happen, but we're not sure. And we need to validate that to unearth the best way to get there.
It's a great point. Like, I was chatting with the CEO of a large pizza chain, and they were thinking about their strategy, and they were trying to think, where should they be going in their organization? Should they have more takeout? Should they have more sit down? Should they have healthier items on their menu? Should they make more types of pizza? So you could think about all these choices, and essentially they're all sort of kind of embedded in that, were a series of hypotheses about what their existing customers want and what potential customers want. But then by designing experiments that were either targeted toward existing customers or potential new customers, they could sort of lay out these hypotheses and then start to experimentally test them to understand not just their existing products, but to give them a broader framework for understanding what should their path forward look like. And I think this is kind of why it's important for organizations, along the lines of what you were just saying, to start thinking about how can this fit into their decision-making.
So let's hit on the Alibaba example. I think this is a great example. And one of the things we talked about at the start of the podcast was about asking the right questions up front and setting the scene correctly to begin with. And if we think about those three levels, that we initially start out with a question, a line of investigation, which feeds into our hypotheses, which then connects through into our experiments. So are you able to give listeners a little bit of an overview of the Alibaba example, where potentially asking a different question up front may have yielded a different outcome?
Yeah, so it's a good example of an organization that I think laudably was experimenting, right? But basically, they had been running these discount programs. So you put something in your shopping cart, Alibaba sees whether the thing is still in your shopping cart or not. And if you leave it sitting there, they could offer you a discount and see whether you're more likely to buy the item afterwards. So they had run an experiment where they tested whether discounts affected behavior. And they found that in the short run, you're more likely to buy the thing that was in your shopping cart if offered a discount, but you're not really spending more overall. And the conclusion that they reached was essentially it's not really worth scaling the program up anymore, and potentially worth like kind of ramping it back down. But now, if you're a leader at Alibaba, like they did a nice job of thinking, can I use an experiment to understand whether this specific program worked and what the implication of it was. But there's this whole second purpose of experiments to say, like, what might a good program look like, or how should you design a program? And there you might start thinking about other hypotheses, like, is it the extent of the discount? Is it the salience of the information? Is it the specific people you're targeting? And by more systematically laying out a program of experimentation, you could start to revamp. And maybe you reach the same conclusion and say, look, there's no version of this that's going to be effective. But actually, maybe you learn something that says it's not the fact that discounts aren't effective. It's the fact that we didn't have them designed in the way that was going to keep people engaged on the platform. So I think by sort of shifting from did this specific thing work to a broader framework building mindset, that having a program of experiments could be a valuable approach for our organizations to take.
Yeah, that's a good point. Rather than thinking of it in binary terms, to ask more broadly, what could those possibilities be? It opens up a number of different opportunities which may have not been considered or thought about previously. So it's a really good example. So just to shift focus a little bit now, your advisory and consulting work has taken you across larger, mature organizations, but also into the startup space as well. How do you see, from your experience, how experimentation differs from the large, mature enterprise and between the startup?
Yeah, so it's a great question, right? Because it's like the feasibility can be different. The goals of experiments could be different. The outcomes you're able to measure may be different. It's hard to kind of give a one-size-fits-all answer, but I would say in general, like early stage experimentation, you might be also testing earlier in the process. You may not be able to do as many large and tests on all of your existing people that you're engaging with, but maybe you could go online and do more little pilots to see different directions to go. So I would say you might, as an early stage organization, kind of bring it back to earlier forms of experimentation as well. So kind of like a simple online A/B test to sort of test different basic ideas or hypotheses, and then kind of think about how that should affect your design. Another thing is, like, I've seen some startups test their product as a whole, and this has been useful in helping them to engage with other stakeholders. So you sort of design an app and you think the app is going to help people save more money. Yeah. So one thing that you could do is you could tell people, here are 3 reasons why I think the app is going to help people save more money. Another thing you could do is team up with an organization that's interested in helping to nudge savings, and then roll out the app to some people, but not everybody, track their savings on the back end and demonstrate what the impact of your app is. And this gives you a powerful new data point and a credible way to communicate what the impact of your app was. And if the app did help people save money, you would have compelling evidence of that. And if not, then that would give you information that you should revamp your app and figure out how can you go back to the drawing board and find something that will help to achieve the goal that you've set out to do. In a more mature organization, some of the struggles are, how do I now scale experimentation? And it's not always that the larger you get and the more data you have, the more experiments you want to run. So kind of give one concrete example that we talk about a little bit in the book is you can think about Uber. So Uber has clearly run lots of experiments, but one lesson that they've learned is as they've grown, as they've scaled, they've got some really big decisions that they're struggling with. Like, do they need new products? Are there new markets they should think about? It wasn't just about running more and more A/B tests, but actually at some point they pivoted a little bit and said, okay, maybe it's not just more experiments, but it's more thoughtful experiments. They actually thought maybe we should run fewer experiments, but for those, we're going to track them longer. We're going to think more carefully about like what exactly we're trying to learn. And we lay out a nice experiment that they had run in the book that had multiple stages, where they were thinking about Uber Express Pool. So they had Uber Express, they had Uber Pool, and they were trying to think like, should we have products that allow people to walk to get in the car or allow people to wait a little bit more? And they started off with just some calibrations on historical data. Then they ran a pilot to see, like, does the product that we're trying to build even work? Then they ran like a synthetic control kind of experiment over a few cities. And they were able to get a better sense of what was happening. And then they went even after that back to the drawing board to say, now can we further tweak it? So they sort of built this whole process around one large strategic decision. And then they did this for other decisions too, but then had many parts of each process to make sure they were getting as much as possible out of this series of experiments that they were running for it.
Yeah, I like that example that you provided in the book where they elevated it up to market level experimentation rather than a focus on micro A/B testing. I think one of the other important things that you discussed there as well was for the startups to be focusing on experimentation as a tool for directionality rather than answering those question of, what should we build? But it's more helping to answer that question, should we build it, and providing looser, maybe trends and indicators of what direction you should head. So yeah, different application, different objectives to a large institutionalized program of experimentation in a large corporate. So a question I'm really interested to ask you about is, based on your experience around consulting, advisory, and research, what are the key pieces of advice that you would give to organizations who are looking to get started with experimentation?
And are you thinking here about organizations that haven't run experiments yet?
Yes, so an organization that is interested but hasn't experimented yet.
Yeah, so here I would again kind of return to thinking about what are the components of experimentation and how might data help. And I would think both about the benefits and the costs of experiments in a particular setting. And in particular, you could think about how important is a given decision within the organization. And the more important it is, the more valuable, more information on it could be. I'd also think about the fidelity of the experiment. So like how clean can the evidence that you're getting going to be? And the cleaner the evidence, the more useful that's going to be. So you could sort of imagine almost a curve where you're trying to figure out what are the things that give more weight to things that are more important and more weight to things that are more have cleaner evidence, and sort of use that to guide decisions about where to land, and then sort of weigh the cost of the experiment against the benefit. Now, kind of getting a little bit more granular, you could imagine thinking about what do you need for an experiment to take off. You need to have some outcome, right? So you need like some thing you're going to track at the tail end to see are you able to move the needle on that objective. You need to be able to randomize people into different conditions, and you need to have a large enough sample, right, to be able to meaningfully estimate what the impact of the change is. So I think there are some kind of core nuts and bolts that leaders need to think about to sort of guide like where they should be experimenting. And then once you've decided that you want to experiment, you want to start to think about what the right questions to ask are. Are you thinking about a hypothesis that you have? Is there a specific product that you're trying to test? So those are some of the general things that we talk about, but it's hard to have like a one-size-fits-all sort of lesson for leaders who are trying to start experimenting. I would give a couple examples. So one in particular comes to mind. I think one thing I've been impressed by over the years is organizations who didn't have a culture of experimenting, who then started. So one cool example I thought is the UK tax department, which we talk about in the book too. And one of the things they have been doing is they have been sending out letters to people who owe back taxes, like, please pay your back taxes. And at some point, somebody from the behavioral insights team kind of had come in and said, well, like two things. Like one, you could use some insights from behavioral economics to increase the likelihood that someone's going to pay their back taxes. But two, you don't just need to believe that it's going to work. You could actually experimentally test to see what the impact of different messages were. So they started by sending a small number of letters to people and found that you could greatly increase tax payment rates by changing the language of the letters going out. And once they tried a few letters, then they started creating a team to sort of say, can we scale up these efforts and try even more letters and try to build some internal frameworks for like, how do you approach tax collection in general? Are there other problems we might want to think about where we could apply this as well? So I think once you're a leader in an organization who kind of gets the nuts and bolts of experimentation, it's easy to see like, oh, here's an area where an experiment is feasible, where it's a pretty important question. In that case, it was one where the cost of experimenting wasn't too high, and it seems like an easy win to start experimenting.
Yeah, I like that summary there, that experimentation is more utilitarian than purely a digital platform, and there's many, many applications and problems to be solved more broadly throughout a business. And if we think about that example there about the letter that marketers have been experimenting with direct mail and catalogs since the 1950s and 60s. So yeah, there's many opportunities that exist outside the realms of a website and app. So let's finish off now with 3 quick questions to close with. First question, an experiment that you've performed or observed that reframed organizational perspective. And this might be something that wasn't explored in the book.
Yeah, so it's a good question. There are a few that come to mind. So the one from the book that I'll just return to briefly is this Airbnb experiment. And I wanted to just sort of highlight that as an example where they had already been experimenting, but by pointing out, oh, here's an extra outcome that you really should be thinking about. And here are some tools to help fight discrimination, got them to reorient their process for experimentation to build a more robust process that would allow them to continue their growth while also kind of being more mindful of challenges on the platform. So I'd say that's one example. During the pandemic, we've used experiments of different types to start to try to figure out how can you better help businesses make decisions. So early on, we were interested in, actually, it was a policy question, like how much how much would giving funding or small grants to small businesses help to increase their likelihood of being able to weather the shutdowns that were happening at the time? And there we ran a series of experiments where we would kind of change the framing of choices and ask questions to businesses about what the likelihood of survival would be given different program availability. And then that gave us useful early information that we could share with policymakers on how do you kind of design a program and what a good design might look like depending on what their policy objectives are. So I would say, if you step into a policy question, you step into a business decision, there are going to be important questions that experiments and data more generally could help. Third example, I'm going to step away from my own research for a second and just say in general, I think that there's a couple of reasons that leaders really should understand experiments and causal inference. So one, organizations should be thinking about how to run and benefit from their own experiments. But two, I would say, even if you're a leader who thinks that you shouldn't be running your own experiment, there's still great value in trying to understand what you could learn from experiments. And here I would sort of point to the fact that it's very rare for a one-size-fits-all policy change or product change to be right for all businesses in all situations. And once that's not the case, then it can be helpful for a leader to be able to step in and say, well, what's the source of the data? What was the variation? Was it experimental? Was it not? If it's not experimental, how much should I trust it? And you can sort of dig in a little bit. You go down that part of the path that maybe you trust a lot and maybe you don't, but it's helpful to be able to think that through. If it's an experiment, it can be helpful to think about what was the outcome being measured? What was the population being studied? How much does that port over to the setting that I care about? And I'll give one concrete example of this, although I could think of many. You can think about remote work. Every company now is thinking about remote work, right? So you're basically, lots of companies have been forced into remote work. And now a lot of companies are interested in, like, is remote work helping? Is it hurting? Should I continue? If I don't continue, What should my return to work policy look like? And there's a lot of guesswork in that. And there's a lot of heterogeneity in what the effect of remote work is for different companies. But one interesting experiment that happened well before the pandemic was run by a company, C-Trip, so a travel agency, where they actually said, let's experimentally test remote work. So they ran a lottery that allowed some people to work remotely. And then afterwards, everyone who opted into lottery, either got the lottery and were able to work remotely or not. And they were able to track productivity, job satisfaction, and it gave them some early read on what the impact of remote work was going to be. So now when they're forced to make a decision around it, they had some information to go on. Now, what should leaders make of this? So one, C-Trip is probably feeling pretty good that they have at least some evidence internally from this that gave them a starting point. So that's kind of a victory that they had that experiment handy to help them make decisions. But two, if you're a leader at another company, maybe you should run your own experiment on this. But certainly, you should be able to look at the existing experiments that others have run and sort of think through, what does that generalize to my setting? What exactly were they testing? Are there other things I might learn from this? And if you don't have kind of a basic fluency in experiments and data, it's pretty hard to think about how that generalizes to me, because you're just going to depend on what somebody else is telling you about it rather than your own sort of understanding of how to interpret that data. So I think kind of getting that skill set could be super valuable for organizations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good example there. Throughout the pandemic, it's thrown up many conditions of uncertainty and ambiguity where it's not possible to know all the answers. And a way that you can potentially find some of the answers to these very difficult questions you're trying to answer is to run experiments. And those experiments may be customer facing, but to your final example there, they may also be internally facing, which impact ways of working, employee engagement, and other parameters inside the business. So quick question number 2. So thinking about 3 resources that you've found helpful in helping you to become more effective at experimentation outside of the Power of Experiments book, what would those 3 resources be?
Yeah, let me start with just 3 types of resources. I think there's lots of resources that are super useful. I would say one type of resource that is useful is research on judgment and decision making. So there's this behavioral economics literature on what are the mistakes we make when we're looking at data or thinking about data. I think that could be helpful for people who just want to get calibrated on, where am I potentially making mistakes in my own decisions, and how might more systematic looks at data help. There you might look at nudge, you might look at some of the Danny Kahneman work, you might look at some of the work by the Behavioural Insights team in the UK. So that's sort of one bucket of things. The second bucket, I would say, is just kind of how do I run an experiment? So what are the nuts and bolts? What are the tools? And there, I think there's a series of good resources on how do you design an experiment and what should the experiment look like. So Gerber Green, if you're looking for a textbook style treatment, I think Mostly Harmless Econometrics has some useful principles. So there are a number of good books, textbooks, and general books that sort of give treatments for some of the technical aspects of it. And the third, I would say, is almost the managerial kind of what are the best practices around experimentation. And there, I also think there's a number of good resources that are starting to come up. Ronnie Kohavi has a nice book. I'm going to misquote the name of it, but kind of like a guy, something like a manager's guide to online experimentation. So if you look up Ronnie Kohavi, you'll see the book. And I think it's a very practical book aimed at somebody who's in an organization who wants to implement an online experiment, and just helps to walk through some of the decisions involved. Try to think if there's other ones along that line. Stefan Topke has a new book on experiments, but I think, when I think about it, rather than any one resource, it would really be thinking about what are these buckets of things that will help to shift my paradigm when thinking about experiments.
Yep. Yeah, good point. Experimentation is multi-dimensional. So think about the buckets rather than any 1, 2, or 3 individual resources. Final question. Where can listeners reach out to you if they'd like to get in contact?
Yeah, so I keep all my research is all on my website. So that's one area for people who just want to read more. I'm on LinkedIn and I'm on Twitter. So if people wanted to find me at either of those.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your time today, Michael. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks. It was great to chat.
That's all from this episode of Experimentation Masters. Just one more thing before we say goodbye. We can use your help to keep improving the show. If you have any feedback or suggestions for future episodes, you can email at gavin@firstprinciples.ventures. Visit firstprinciples.ventures for show notes, resources, and information. If you enjoyed this show, give us a share on social media. Make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss an episode. Experimentation Masters. Lead with more confidence.